Let me verify things are coming through on stream.
Is that beautiful?
Great. I have to watch an Adam Man thing. An Adam Man thing. Oh, there we go. An Adam Man. Cool. Alright, let me switch scenes. Boom. Alright, that's better. And thank you for following, Anthony. Appreciate it. Let's see. You guys can see this. Looks good. Alright, so today on the agenda, we're going to look at this clean architecture template that I have out on GitHub and see if we can fix it up, clean up some issues, add a couple features. I've got a couple hours to devote to this, so if you have any questions or want to ask anything about .NET or anything else, feel free. Since this will end up on YouTube, I thought it'd also be a good idea for me to share a couple other quick resources. So apologies if you already know all this stuff, but I have a podcast out there at weeklydevtips.com that you can check out. And it's been mostly weekly this year, actually. Last year there were a few gaps where I missed a lot of time, but yeah, it's coming out mostly every week. Although right now I don't think I have one scheduled for Monday, so I need to get on that. I also do work on the DevBetter website, a lot of times on stream. And DevBetter is a private coaching group that I started about a year and a half ago. And we have about 10 members or so, and we meet every week. We just met this morning. We talk about whatever's on people's minds, trying to advance their careers. So we do some hands-on code exercises and things, try and help with tech skills. But we also talk about things like resume building, interviews, how to find a job, how to keep a job, how to get promoted, personal branding, things like that. Today we talked a little bit about Pluralsight and how to get in as a Pluralsight author, or how to do video recording. If you want to learn more about clean architecture, which is what we're talking about today, we talk about it in the Domain-Driven Design Fundamentals course, and the source code that you can download with this course has, its best sample that's in kind of the same architecture, but for .NET 4, not .NET Core. So you can check that out. It's got a full-fledged sample application that you can check out and walk through. Pluralsight's free for the whole month of April, so if you're watching this and it's still April 2020 and you don't have a subscription, you should be able to access this for free this month. If nothing else, you could hop on there and then grab the download, and then you'll have the demos. The demos are actually out on my GitHub too, a version of them, so you can look for that also on my GitHub. Alright, so we're done with all that stuff. Let's close those out. Here's my streaming checklist that I have. If you do streaming yourself, you can use this to kind of give you a list of things you might want to do as you're getting ready to stream. If you have any things that you do that you would recommend I add to this list, let me know. I would certainly appreciate it. But this is pretty much what I just went through getting ready to start up here. And there's my Twitter, which I just updated. I'll leave that open for later. Okay. Nobody has any questions. What does play do, Surly Dev? What are you hoping to get with that command? I don't know what that even does. Song request is now playing. Interesting. So I've got Carl Franklin's Music to Code By running. Music to Code By Carl Franklin, which you can find here. And he's given me permission to use this on my stream. So it's 25-minute streams of music that you can listen to while you're coding or doing other work. So it's a good source of royalty-free music that you can get if you're going to stream or do YouTube videos. You can get permission from Carl, and as long as you reference it, promote it, link to it, he's usually okay in my experience with people using it. So check that out. But I don't have it wired up to a command in the chat for Twitch, unfortunately. So the play command I don't think is going to let you switch songs or anything like that, if that was what you're hoping for. Okay, so let's look at issues. Let's do some triage here. So this has gotten bigger than I would like in terms of quantity, so I need to close a few of these. So let's see, we got modify it to support CQRS from 2018. That's getting a little old. Separate branch in this repo. The reason why I didn't do this is because I didn't think in 2018, on my birthday, in 2019 even, that this was a very good common use case, right? So CQRS I think is interesting, and it's a good principle to apply in many applications. But this is a solution template. It's not a sample app, so there's not anything that prevents you from doing CQRS in here. We had some folks suggest, hey, you can add mediator to this, and that's still something that I might do here. Splitting things up into different API endpoints might be another way to make it so that this was easier to do in a CQRS basis, because you'd easily be able to split all your commands from your queries that way, and maybe that's enough. So I think I'm just going to close this and leave a note that says, at this point, I think perhaps demonstrating how to use separate endpoints, which could be grouped according to CQRS principles, will have to be sufficient for the main version of this template. Closing. Alright, so that'll clean that up. But I could add another issue for adding API endpoints to this. So add API endpoint support. Demonstrate how to use API endpoints in the solution template. Note how these can be used to achieve CQRS. There we go. CQRS is command, query, responsibility, segregation. And the idea there is that the type of logic that you need to apply to write operations, which are represented by commands, tends to be different from the type of logic you would apply to read-only operations or queries. And so breaking those up into two different paths in your application often has architectural benefits. For instance, maybe you want to add a caching layer to your queries to improve performance. Well, caching doesn't really make sense on most commands because commands are mutating state, and you don't want to provide cached logic back to them after they just made a change. You want them to see the most recent change, after their change has been applied. And so you might only apply caching on the query side of things. It is kind of like separation of concerns. It's a specific form of separation of concerns, yes. It's mainly used to, like I say, for architectural reasons. Commands could be done all synchronously and immediately, but commands could also benefit sometimes from being just added to a queue and done later. And it's another architectural decision that you can do, and it's much easier to do that if you've already broken up your paths, your workflows, your features, to split commands from queries than if they were all together, right? If there was no separation. And you would not want to use message queues or queue up commands for queries typically, because usually when somebody issues a GET request, they expect to just get it. Yeah, exactly, like Amazon orders. That's the example I always use. So you want to be able to have a different path for how you deal with commands and then how you deal with queries. That's all CQRS is about. Alright, so we are net zero change on issues because I got rid of one, but I created one. But the new one is newer, so it doesn't look like I've ignored this thing for years. And we're up into only 2019. So someone wanted to know, how do I do multi-tenancy? And I'm saying this is probably a good idea. And we're going to say closing for this repo. If someone implements a good sample, forking off of this repo, I'll be happy to link to it in the README. Alright, so hey, if anybody wants to do a sample that shows how to do multi-tenant applications, here's the steps you would basically need to take to have a template for one. Again, I think this is more advanced than most people are going to want out of a solution template, which is the intended purpose of this repo, is to just act as file new .NET Core solution, ASP.NET Core solution. That's why I'm not implementing these features in here. So we're going to close this one as well. And now we're making progress, man. We're down to just 18 open issues. Okay, so template support for Visual Studio on Mac. Will template be supported Visual Studio on Mac anytime? Probably MPAC is needed. I have a Mac right here, but I haven't opened it in a couple months, and I'm not a regular user of Visual Studio for Mac, so I'm not planning on doing this. But we will add some labels here and say, you know what, that would be an enhancement where I want help. Be a great first issue for somebody, but I'm not going to do it. So I think I'll leave that there for now and see if anybody wants to work on that. Anybody here using Visual Studio for Mac? You want to work on applying this? Basically, it sounds like they don't just use standard solution files, which seems odd, because then how would you ever collaborate on? I don't know. This seems weird to me. You know, I'm going to ask a question here as well. Shouldn't VS for Mac be able to just open the .sln and .cs proj files? I mean, that's .NET Core is cross-platform, and I know I've done work on this exact file on my Mac, so I'm not sure what the deal is with this. We'll see if he still wants to talk about it a year later. Alright. Okay. Infrastructure registry. What does that mean? Oh yeah, we talked about this. I was trying to implement infrastructure registry. There's a pull request on here. Did this thing ever get merged? I think it was a draft. I think this is one of my pull requests that's still sitting out there. Yeah. So Scott was working on this a while ago, and I don't know what the latest status of this is. I asked him again 6 months ago what the deal is with this. Hey, what just happened? C# Fritz is hosting my stream for 119 viewers. Sweet. Welcome everybody. Appreciate the raid. I haven't gotten a raid from C# Fritz in a while. We're going to stop for a minute and review what we're doing here. So, hey everybody. Welcome. I'm Steve Smith, Ardalis, if you haven't heard of me. Defend. Yeah, nice. Fight off the raiders. So C#, are you jumping in here? I see Coding Bandit. Are you cutting short your Blazor? Ask me anything? I know. Oh, there you are. I knew you were working on that today. How'd your stream go? Thank you for following, Anthonit. Appreciate it. And Crazy Pizza Dwarf. You guys can all follow me. It would be just fine. I won't get upset if you follow me. You're not stalking me. So I usually stream just on Fridays, like 12 to 2, usually about ASP.NET Core topics. Thanks for the follow, Webface. It was fun. We answered a lot of Blazor questions, built a Blazor component to emulate Windows 98. I'll bet there's a lot of demand for that. Digging the quarantine beard. Yes, it's getting rather full at this point. Webcam only. Yeah, so it's the quarantine hair too. I don't usually go with a super long haircut, but yeah, it's coming along. Although my wife's not a fan, so it may have to go away before quarantine does, because when I started this, I didn't expect quarantine to last for months as opposed to weeks. Lots of demand for Windows 98. Yes, I'm sure. Alright, so for those of you that may not have heard of Clean Architecture, or my Clean Architecture solution template, that's what I'm working on today. This is an open source thing. It's out on GitHub. It's got 4,200 stars. A few people have used it. And it's basically a starting point for building your ASP.NET Core solution using Clean Architecture. And what is Clean Architecture? Well, it's a breakdown in how you organize your solution into different projects, and kind of informs where different things should go so that you have an easy to maintain application that leverages solid design principles, and leverages some of the framework features like dependency injection support. One thing I haven't added to it actually is Blazor, so probably sometime soon I'll add some Blazor support into this thing too. Right now, if we just open up the application and just run it, did someone say DDD? Any DDD? Yeah, of course there's DDD in there. That's kind of one of my things. So yeah, the domain-driven design fundamentals course that the bot is pushing there on chat uses a very similar architecture to this one, although that course is due for an update. It's on .NET 4, not .NET Core, and so we're going to be updating it, Julie Lerman and I, probably sometime later this year. But when you run this thing, it's not a sample application, right? It's just a solution template. So it has like the bare minimum of things that you would need when you're getting ready to start an application in ASP.NET Core, and you want to follow these clean architecture principles and kind of structure. So think of it like file new solution. And in fact, there is a solution template, this project template here that you can install that Greg Trevelik actually created for me. And so you can grab that, and then you literally can in Visual Studio just say, give me a new clean architecture solution, and it'll create it for you. Otherwise, you just start by downloading this zip file, and then dropping it wherever you want, and then renaming things accordingly. So, thank you for following, Mobab0. Appreciate it. Yagni, is it using Yagni? Kinda, sorta. I mean, you kind of need to make a decision about your solution structure close to the start of your application. So Yagni, which stands for you aren't going to need it, and is a caution against over-architecting things up front. I'm usually pretty sure that I'm going to want to have code that's loosely coupled. I'm going to want to have code I can test. I'm going to want to have code that kind of follows dependency inversion principle. And getting that later, if you design things in the wrong way, where your dependencies are flowing in the wrong direction, is painful. And I've experienced that pain, and I've helped many of my clients get out of that pain. So I don't think of as Yagni being a thing that I would use to avoid doing this template. Smab UK, I studied use this template when I was getting started in C#, very enlightening. Appreciate it. Thanks for the follows, Boom Boom and Harrison464. C# Fritz, are you sticking around or did you run off on me? No, you're still here. So if you want to stick around, I'd love to hear what you think about where things are going with this, and I'm sure your audience is full of Blazor people that know a lot more about Blazor than I do. So, I'd be happy to see where we can add some Blazor to this. That would make sense in a solution template. Like, what would be something that would make sense to have in terms of Blazor that every solution that you start with should just have sitting there ready to go. And if you don't need it, you can always rip it out. But like right now, in the web project, I have a controller that has some really bare bones controller stuff. So there's like a to-do controller here that just kind of lets you populate or view a list of to-do items. Let me jump to Visual Studio. It's probably a little better than GitHub. So there's also an API controller that has API-based actions to deal with these to-do items. Now, obviously, in your real application, you're not going to use to-do items probably, so you can rip those out. But it just kind of shows you what the expected way of working with it is. But then there's also Razor Pages here. So you can also have this to-do thing that shows how it would work with Razor Pages. And so here's a view template, a Razor Page template that lists out the to-do items, and then here's how that works. So I could probably see at a minimum a Blazor version of showing the to-do items and being able to manage the to-do list in Blazor. I'm not sure what the standard way of structuring that would be. Like, where would I put that in Blazor? Would I just have another page called Blazor to-do list, and then drop that in the root of this thing perhaps, and then have an API that it's calling back to that it works with, maybe the existing to-do item controller? I mean, that would be easy enough to do. Brave Cobra 2, well, let me see. Boom Boom says, changing dependency flow is purgatory for software engineers. It's painful if you have to do it after the fact on a big legacy application. That's for sure, if that's what you're saying. Yagni and experience are a fine balance. Yes. I usually split application domain and persistence as well instead of one core project. Persistence is not in core. Persistence is an infrastructure. So everything that has to do with persistence lives inside this data folder inside of our infrastructure. Inside core, we just have the domain model. So if you're doing domain-driven design, this is where your entities, your aggregates, your domain services would live. This is also where your interfaces would live. Right now, I'm not using any interfaces that aren't already defined in a shared project called shared kernel, but I would typically have an interfaces folder in core as well. SurlyDev wants to know, is .web an MVC project? It's a .NET Core project, so it has MVC. So if we look at the things that it has, it doesn't even list MVC here, but by virtue of the fact that it's a .NET Core App 3.1, it does have access to the ASP.NET Core MVC stuff. Yeah, that would work. You would need to add a component folder, Field Marshal says. A Blazor component using Razor Pages and Views, right? Yeah. The hosted model template is a good example of how Blazor folks do their split. Alright, I should check that out. I could just file new one of those real quick. I haven't looked at that in a few months. What's the shared kernel project for? Looking at the README, I didn't see a section for it. Ooh, that's a good point, my friend. Let's take care of that real quick. We're going to go over here and say document shared kernel and say, what's that project all about? This should be in the README. Alright, so I will talk about that, but basically shared kernel would be things that belong, things that should be shared between solutions. So it's usually like base classes and things like that. So let's drill into just the shared kernel here for a moment. So in clean architecture shared kernel, you would have a base domain event that you might use. You would have a base entity that you might use. And you could modify this if you didn't want to be restricted to using integer IDs. You could switch that to use a GUID. You could easily follow this comments advice and have a base identity of TID here, and then just replace this with TID. And then anywhere you want that you're using this thing, you would just specify whether it was an entity using an integer or a GUID key, for instance. Go back to that. Alright. Let's see. Trying to follow on the comments. Sorry. Blazor. Is Blazor and MVC complementary or mutually exclusive? They are complementary, I believe. You can certainly have an MVC application and then just add some Blazor to it. Blazor is a client-side technology, or at least it acts like one if you're using Blazor on the server. So it's view only in my experience. So there's no reason why you couldn't use it with an MVC app, with Razor Pages, with whatever. You could include all those things in one web project. I'm not saying you should, but you could, right? They could all work side by side. And like in this example, I have API controllers with MVC controllers with Razor Pages. Most projects are not going to use all of those, right? So they're there so you can kind of see how each one of those works, but probably you're going to rip out the ones you don't need, right? So if you're not using MVC in terms of actual views, right, you don't need this views folder because you're just doing APIs or you're just doing Razor Pages, you would rip those out, right? And you would just keep the pieces that you need. I could fork this thing and somehow ship it with different project templates, kind of like they have in the box for an API versus an MVC versus a Razor Page. I don't want to do that because it just adds a maintenance nightmare for me to have to keep all those things separate. So, and it's not that unusual to have more than one of them in a single project. Back to shared kernel. Let me just wrap up what I was saying there. Normally, you would not have this as part of the solution. Normally, shared kernel would be in a NuGet package that you would reference, and it would be an internal NuGet package that your company would keep and publish and version. And so this solution would refer to the shared kernel. It's the core project at a minimum, and probably the others would refer to that NuGet package. And any teams that were depending on that, ideally in your company, in your organization, would agree before updates were made to that shared kernel that would potentially break them. And so if you are in a company that has 3 different teams building 3 different apps, and you all need to use similar things, you all agree you want to use clean architecture, for instance, then you would create acme.sharedkernel, and you would put your base types in there, and now all of you would just leverage that shared NuGet package for your solutions. Alright, so we got through P. question. Brave Cobra 2. So where's the logic that acts between domain objects? That would be typically domain services. Now this doesn't really have anything because it's a template, right? But this is where you would handle operations involving multiple aggregates or entities. And so if you had some service that needed to like transfer money from one user to another, and that didn't belong on the account entity, let's say, you could have a I don't know, money transfer service or whatever that worked with two accounts or two users, and that would be a domain service that would live in core. The one bigger project I have is using this as clean architecture model as a template. Cool. Thanks for the follow, the Badass Pony. Blazor WASM template also has new options for PWA and auth at last. That's cool. More followers. Thank you, Malachi and Synthoxis. Cool name. Hint, don't use GUIDs as keys. Inserting new values will be indexing overload, or rather don't use GUIDs as primary keys. There's definitely pros and cons to different key selections. The biggest benefit of using GUIDs as keys in my experience is that the client can create the entities. So you don't have to wait for an extra round trip from the database to find out what the next identity number is on an integer key. And so if you're doing an application that has a lot of distribution to it, and you'd like for any client to be able to work offline, create entities, create hierarchies of entities that have key relationships between them, and you don't want to have to wait to figure out what the actual IDs are until you save it to the database because you're working offline, then GUIDs make all kinds of sense. Every phone app, every offline web app, Blazor app, they could all be creating these whole structures of objects with their exact keys offline, and whenever you get around to syncing up, you could just push all that stuff up into your data store and nothing changes, right? They already have their keys, so the keys remain what they are. You don't have to do some kind of magic where you have some temporary key that then switches out to the actual ID when the database identity thing kicks in. But there are performance issues potentially with keys, whether it's indexing, whether it's just the size of the key column. A GUID key is going to be bigger in terms of database storage space than IDs, and that also has a performance impact both on indexes and on just queries in general. So it's a balance. Generally, space is cheap, and usually, for most applications, good enough performance is good enough. But if you really want to maximize speed, you want those keys to be as small as possible, and ideally they should be integers, not strings or GUIDs, or shorts or some other type of int. Have you used Mediator in this project? I don't think I have Mediator in this project currently. I have talked about it, so that's one of the things that we're looking at as we go through my issue list on GitHub out here. Is Mediator, I think, is one of the things in here that was possibly something to add. So we may look at that, but I don't think it's in there currently. So Kabazi, thanks. So you have domain services. What about application services? Logic across domains. Well, logic across domains would be outside of this solution probably, because this solution lives within a bounded context, and maybe you would use it for multiple different microservices if you wanted to, if you're following that type of architecture, and they would need to communicate with one another through messages or through exposed APIs. You might have an anti-corruption layer that you would talk through between this service and others, but this represents just one service, right? Just one bounded context in a larger system. If you have more of them in the system. If you want to see an example, a more complicated example of a real application, check out eShop on containers, which I help with sometimes. This is a Microsoft reference application that shows how to structure something that is a little bit more complicated. It's got a whole bunch of different services that all talk to one another. And so if you haven't seen this, you can take a look. Be prepared. It's not simple, right? It's not a solution starter template. It's a full-fledged application. It's running with microservices and containers and Kubernetes, and it's got a whole bunch of different services. If you want to see this exact same application, right, it's basically this store right here is what it's running. eShop on containers. You want to see this exact same application using clean architecture in a monolithic, and I don't say that in a pejorative way, but just the way it's deployed is as a single unit, then this eShop on web reference app that I maintain, also for Microsoft, and I have a PDF book that you can grab here for free that talks about it, is a much simpler starting point. So this also uses clean architecture, essentially. So if you look at the structure, it looks very familiar to what I have in my clean architecture template. There's a reason for that. The domain model is in core. The infrastructure is, in infrastructure. All the data access persistence is limited to inside infrastructure. So check this out if you want to see, a working example of a real application, a real sample reference application that's built using this. All right, some more questions. So, Syntaxis, what are you coding? Well, eventually I'm going to stop answering questions. I'm going to write some more code that has to do with these issues. So we'll get to that. Like sagas, GUID is along behind the scenes. So how do you handle DB merges? I see. So if you don't use GUIDs, how do you handle database merges like in sagas? And they're having a side conversation, it looks like. So boom, GUIDs work just as well if they're non-primary keys. For data dedupe, though, I can't rely on GUIDs. You can identify a piece of data because multiple people create identical entities in the same domain, and we have to check to see if they're the same. Yeah, so users can screw you up, that's true. If you're referring to inability to simply port integer index things from source to target without collision, I just increment the keys uniformly in transit. Well, that sounds dangerous. Not sure how that would work. So what, you just notice that all the things that got created on one system are, 50 integer units behind the IDs on the other system, so you just add 50 to all of them? That might work in a really simple case for one table, but I have a hard time seeing how that's going to work effectively for a lot of tables in a complex merge of systems. But yeah, I mean, keys are a design thing that you have to think about. If you're just building a single simple application, you don't care about other applications, integer keys work great. If you're going to be using a distributed application model, GUID keys have a lot of benefits. They have some performance drawbacks. They also have things like, your URLs are going to look like crap. So when I go to this URL and it's issue number 109, it's kind of nice that I can just go to /109, right? As opposed to 16 character long or whatever it is GUID format that I have to type in. So there's usability reasons why you choose integers as well, because you can just put them in your routes and things like that. But you can definitely use multiple different types of keys also. So there's another option is that you have an integer ID that maybe you don't expose for the most part, and you have a GUID key or even a surrogate key that you use for other things to index into things. There's lots of ways to skin that cat, lots of ways to do key generation. And you don't have to pick one for your whole app, right? It can make sense to use different types of keys for different types of entities, and that's why, getting back to this model here, this template, your base entity type can easily support multiple key types, even in the same application, by just making that generic. Alright. Let me get back to my issue list and we'll start looking at some code. So scroll down to the bottom here, left that one alone. Let's look at this infrastructure registry. That's what we were looking at right as folks were coming in. And we said this was part of Estepau's pull request. It's been out there stale for a while, so we'll let that sit. Let's see what he says about the status of that. We have a question about what is the best place for GraphQL in an application like this. And I never answered this, so I don't have a lot of experience with GraphQL in .NET or otherwise. So I'm not sure what the answer is on this one. That's why I've left it here. Anyone have any thoughts on where GraphQL would sit inside of clean architecture? I mean, I think it mostly lives in, like, the implementation of it lives in infrastructure. And maybe I could try that. Maybe I could try adding GraphQL library to this clean architecture in a different branch and see how that would work. So let's say I think I would need to experiment with this to have a good answer a year later. If anyone has a fork or suggestion or wants to make a PR, that would be helpful as well. And so I'm going to leave that out there and we'll see if anyone wants to help. And it is a question, and so if any of you want to comment on that, feel free. But I'll try and take some time to play with that. Maybe even today, but I don't think that's the first thing that's the most important. All right, let's go back to the chat because we're having an active chat. Brave Cobra says your URLs don't have to contain a database, just a unique identifier. Certainly, right? You could always just add an ID or whatever you want to call it. You just, this number here doesn't have to be the database primary key. Certainly, right? That's obvious. Surly Dev says that 109 shouldn't refer to a database ID. I raised a point with Carl Franklin years ago that number in his route with a database ID and not a show number. Oh, so like on .NET Rocks, he's got a database ID that's different from the show number, probably because his identity sequence got out of step at some point when he deleted something. Is that what you're saying, Surly Dev? I would agree that he did have. Yeah, okay. I would agree that the number on there doesn't have to represent a database ID, and in many cases shouldn't represent a database ID. But for convenience purposes, for small, simple apps, especially ones that aren't open to the public, it's often the simplest thing to do. John Galloway, how's it going, man? I haven't seen you in a while. Team meeting URLs have 3 GUIDs in them. Yes. And they're so nice to just type out. Yeah, okay. Coding Bandit says, what, you don't want to send user an order ID of some GUID? But I claim that someone coming through the URL would be more likely to be looking for a specific show number, which might not refer to an integer ID in a database. Right, yeah, I'd agree with that. GraphQL is a pain if it's exposed too openly. Users can bring down your database. Well, that's the thing about GraphQL, right? GraphQL has all the same characteristics that ORMs had in that big fight from 10 or 15 years ago, right? Now, it used to be that database DBAs and database administrators, the same thing, would strictly control access to the database. And one of the ways that they might do that is by requiring that everything your application does go through store procedures. And then all the application developers kind of said, you know what, we have this ability to generate a lot of that database code, and store procedure requirement is just slowing us down, and we need to ship code, and we need to move faster. And for the most part, the application developers won that fight, and now we use things like Entity Framework all the time, or in Hibernate, or LLVLGen, or whatever you want, and they generate the SQL that talks to the database and persists things. And what we're seeing with GraphQL, in my opinion, is the same exact thing, where you have a bunch of front-end developers, the actual people that are building the apps that end users are integrating with, and the back-end developers that are responsible for those APIs are the new DBAs, right? They're the new people that are like, hey, we're going to control and exactly specify how you're going to get that data and how it's going to come through. And the front-end devs are saying, look, we just want to move fast. Having to go through your specific APIs is slowing us down. What if we just had a way that we could just generate what we need and call through one endpoint that does everything we need, and that's what GraphQL is. It's like the same thing where now it's the API developers that are being seen as slowing down the front end devs, and GraphQL provides a way to bypass that. Is what I'm seeing. And yeah, so it's not without risks, right? There's been plenty of stories about how ORMs did stupid things to databases and caused performance problems, right? There's going to be plenty of horror stories about how GraphQL lets front-end developers do stupid things to data or to the APIs that aren't good for the app. But that doesn't mean that people aren't going to keep using them, right? And they're going to get better, and they're going to learn. And I don't think that they're going away anytime soon. John Galloway, and that's why no one is talking about Teams bombing like they do with Zoom. Yeah, okay, so it's a security feature. Brave Cobra 2, it's like exposing iQueryable. Yeah, GraphQL, it kind of is. Over the wire, right? Not just within your code on the server. Alright. Why did you have to expose the order ID of my lime green mankini? That's what that GUID came from. Alright. It's a fantastic way of explaining the why for GraphQL. Thank you. Thank you for following, Tech Guy Will. That's not the order for that. It's the order for my dinosaur onesie. Alright. Let's get back to my list of issues here. I'll try and keep up with the chat as well, but it's always a challenge to multitask here on the stream. Why not use context.update entity? Alright, let's look at this. I was wondering why not use context.update in EF repository and try to update and save an entity that contained nested entities. This didn't work, and it would be bad to make those virtual. Okay. And he says, thank you, Connor. So Scott, last year, did an experiment here and has a branch with experiment code. And at the end of the day, there's no reason why this EF repository couldn't be virtual. That's true. Quick reply and the sample. Possibly. Alright. So we had a conversation about this. Someone else jumped in with another question. Did they? Did they? I don't see where that Yuri's question even came in here. He must have moved it. Maybe. Alright. Yeah, Scott's great. Brave Cobra, I'll do a stream on copy paste to help you out. Alright, I don't know where this ended up. Just let me know and I'll provide it in a timely manner. Maybe this is waiting on Scott. He's actually me. Oh, yeah. Okay, it ended up with me having put this off apparently. Explain the flow. The controller action does this. It says, get this item, and if it's good, then update section item. Where the heck did section item come from? That's not going to compile, but okay, it's pseudocode. Maybe that's this. I don't know. Otherwise, return a new item view model with that item. Or maybe that's this. Maybe that's this. Alright. So take the item view model, convert it into an entity called item, and then update that item. That seems fine. That's good. Okay. And the item view model has some stuff on it, including a way to copy itself to an item. That sounds good. And the base dialog item view model. Why do I care about this? This thing has a bunch of code that also does copies of things. So this is a utility class that tries to copy all the properties. Okay. Base dialog item. Is modeled state that is valid still needed? No, it's not, Brave Cobra. They do that behind the scenes, but only if you use API controller, right? So we can't see here whether he's using that API controller attribute, but realize this is from a year ago, so 2.2 was just coming out back then. But you're correct. Right now, it should be pretty rare that you would see these checks in an API. It's possibly changed. The reason why the hack comment states possibly is I don't check if it's changed since it was retrieved, and I just set the value to it whether it's changed or not. Alright, I'm just going to say, hey, if this is still an issue, let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to close this. Actually, I'm going to close this. Hi, Connor. Connor. Sorry, I didn't follow up on this in a timely manner. If this is still an issue with the current design, please reopen this issue and I'll try to sort it out. Closing. Last part's probably not needed because, you know what, he's going to see it's closed. Alright, so I hate to do that, but I have to get rid of some of these older ones. Otherwise I'm not going to get to any of the new ones. And I don't know if that issue is still even an issue. Add singleton not works. Alright, this is an order. Well, he asked about this 6 months ago and no one answered, so closing, reopen, if still an issue, boom. Yeah, okay, no more comments. Good, good. Let's just keep chugging through these till we get to some code we can write. Where should helper classes like type helper, string helper, etc. live? So this is a question. People have some opinions on this. My general opinion on this, if you look at this code, right? Let's just close everything. Here's your structure, right? You've got web, you've got core, you've got infrastructure. If you look at what depends on what, we look at the dependencies on projects for core. The only project it depends on is shared kernel. If we look at shared kernel, same deal. Look at its dependencies. It only depends on the SDK, right? It doesn't depend on anything. Infrastructure, looking at its projects, depends on core and shared kernel, and web is going to depend on all the other things, right? So web is the thing that depends on everything else. It's at the top of the stack. So dependencies, projects. That's weird. It should totally depend on core too. But I guess since infrastructure depends on those other two, it picks it up transitively. So the reason I point that out is when you're thinking about where you should put something in here, if you don't have any dependencies on infrastructure or UI, and by infrastructure I mean anything outside of your running code. It talks to a database, it talks to the file system, it talks to an email server, it talks to the system clock. If it does any of those things, it's outside of your code running in memory, it's infrastructure. All right. So if you have a service or a utility or something that doesn't talk to any infrastructure and isn't specific to your user interface, then put it in core. An easier way of saying that is if you can put it into core without having to add to its dependencies, then put it in core, right? Because core's main goal is to stay free of dependencies so it's easy to test and easy to change. It should be mostly abstractions, and it should be business logic, high-level stuff. Right? The level of abstraction in core should be high. It should know things like, I need to add an item to this order, not I need to insert a row into this table. Right? See the difference in terms of abstraction level? And by keeping all the dependencies out of core, it makes it really easy to test it. Which is something that if you've ever worked in legacy code that doesn't have that, as soon as you start adding dependencies into your business logic that you want to test, it makes it really hard to test. And then testing, often goes out the window because it's not worth the trouble, and that just makes it even harder for you to manipulate or refactor or improve the design of that application. All right, so core is optimized for testability and for low dependencies. And so when we look back at this, and he's asking where should these helpers go, if they don't have any dependencies on anything, they probably belong in core. Right? If you want to create a helpers class in core that has things like string helper and the only thing it talks about is strings, that's fine. Right? That doesn't have to go in the web project or the infrastructure project because it doesn't have a dependency on anything but string, which is a language primitive. That and avoid stat. Okay, so Brave Cobra 2. Let me back up first. Surly Dev says, my question about 3 GUIDs was a serious question. Would it be better to be just one GUID or a shorter ID because you still need Teams authentication to join the meeting? Better. I think it would be better from a usability standpoint. I mean, you're probably still going to just copy paste the thing. A Zoom link has a relatively short, Zoom ID that you can grab, but most people still just copy paste it. The thing about having an integer ID is that it's much easier for malicious people to just try off by ones on that, right? And so that's what you see with the Zoom bombing, is that they're not authenticated, which is the problem. If they're just open to the public, which that was the default previously, but they've since changed that default. It was really easy for someone to just write a script that would just sequence through all the different IDs, and you could run that in any kind of tool you want. You could run it into console of Chrome if you wanted to, and it would go and find you something that gave you back a particular response that showed you there was a meeting in progress. That's harder to do with GUIDs just because the address space is so much bigger and they're not sequential. So yes, you could certainly take those 3 GUIDs that are in Teams and replace it with one GUID, and it would be easy on the back end to have a table that said, hey, when you have this one GUID, it maps to these 3 GUIDs, right? Go look them up, just as an aggregator, essentially. Now, it would shorten those URLs probably significantly without really changing anything too much. But the difference between a URL with one GUID and a URL with 3 GUIDs is not really that different from a usability perspective, because you're not going to type that in either way, right? If it's already too long to type in, then there's not a lot of benefit in going from a really long thing to a still too long to type in thing, I would guess. Any plans on adding service discovery supports, remote centralized configuration, that, and avoid statics in core? Yes. Unless the helpers are shared, then they go in shared kernel. Yes, exactly. So, anything that I say about things that go in core applies to shared kernel, doubly so, right? So you don't want to put things that have dependencies in core. You really don't want to put things that have dependencies in shared kernel, because every core of every solution will depend on that. And so you're going to be pulling that dependency into every solution that you're building at that point that uses that shared kernel. Now, sometimes you decide that that's okay, and you decide you want to do that. So you might, in shared kernel, you might decide, hey, we're going to use autofac for dependency injection everywhere. And we're going to just put that in shared kernel so that everybody has it, and it's the same version, and we can use modules and other features even in core if you wanted to like wire up your services to their interfaces, for example, for your domain services. You could do that. Yeah, there is a browser size limit on query parameters, but it's like 4K, so your 32 character or whatever it is GUID is not going to hit it, even if you have 3 of them, right? If that's all you have. But sure, eventually you'll run into trouble if you have enough of those things on there. Yeah. Cool. All right, I think I'm good on the chat. So let's look back at this question. Where should helper classes go? I want to know about organize files. Okay. They're looking at it for NOP Commerce. That's cool. I did a talk for their conference back in November of 2019. Might have been 2018. I don't remember. Must have been 2018. Alright, so here's some things that somebody wrote, and somebody +1 this, and it was not me. Okay. You missed your services. Alright, I'll come back to you, Brave Cobra. And centralized config. Service discovery. Can you elaborate on service discovery support? Are you looking for something that works with, well, I don't know, just elaborate. I mean, I have OpenAPI support. That's kind of service discovery, right? It defines what all my services are. If I go in here and I run this thing and I say, show me the API, that's there. Something like console of HashiCorp. I don't know those, sorry. I've not worked with them. So can you tell me what console, and I don't know if that was supposed to be an of or if that was an or. Is it console of HashiCorp or is it console or HashiCorp? Wait for him to reply. Alright, so here's a breakdown of where things might go. Splitting things up in here. He says, as contracts would go in core, as messages, as domain stuff, yes. Without external implementation, yes. Application logic could go in infrastructure. I'd probably move that. Application setup, yeah, that's fine. If or at least have modules specific to infrastructure in here. Persistence, yes. Message broker, yes. And in web, you might have different APIs. You might have these broken up with CQRS, so you might have a separate read API. That makes sense. Presentation API that just provides sort of a backends for front ends pattern, I'm guessing, for just the UI to talk to. That's fine. Alright, I think that this sounds good. So, copy. You have a hard name to pronounce. Zynam. So, I'd agree with at him. Peter. Boom. Done. Hopefully that's good enough. Alright. HashiCorp wrote console. Service discovery helps avoid referring to external services directly. Service mesh is really... Okay, now I know what you're talking about. So, an example of that I've worked with would be the service discovery that Identity Server has. So, Identity Server for docs. If you haven't used Identity Server, it's a nice open source free tool that you can use to kind of centralize your authentication stuff. And one of the things that it provides that does what we're talking about here is an endpoint that basically gives you all the other URLs you need. And it's sort of a service discovery that kind of tells you, here's all the things that are available. So this discovery endpoint here, I think I can hit this one, will show you all the different endpoints that you need. And so when you wire up a new, and I wish there was an easy way to make this prettier. Is there any way to format this here? There's probably some Chrome plugin that'll format it. But here's the authorization endpoint, right? And so I don't have to hard code a link to the authorization endpoint. I can just know that I need to hit this thing first to get the list of endpoints, and I can cache that, right? I don't have to hit it every time. And now I know, like, here's the token endpoint, there's the authorization endpoint that I showed you, here's the user info endpoint, etc. And it's providing that discovery. So the answer to the question that Brave Cobra is asking, do I intend to include this in a default solution template that should be usable by any .NET developer building any application, any ASP.NET core application? I think that's probably not a required thing that is going to be used by that many people, right? So probably not. I could see linking to it if there were an easy way to add that to this. And if it really is trivial to add, then maybe I would do it. But I don't know what I would need to do off the top of my head to do that. and console from HashiCorp. Console HashiCorp. I've literally never looked at this. So, secure service and networking, learn. There's a lot of stuff there. Let's see, docs, install, configure, learn. Brave Cobra's not telling me anything else. I assume you've used this. Install it. What if I want to use it with ASP.NET Core? How would I do that? There. Alright, so Cecil's written about this. Service discovery, right, okay. Now, if my clean architecture template was only for APIs, it was only for microservices, then I could totally see adding this built in, for sure, because I think there it would be used frequently. Alright, so you go in here, and you create a singleton for your console client, and tell it where it gets configured with its address. Alright. And do a bunch of setup for all the stuff. And is console like managing this in the cloud, or is this all local once I get it going? I'm hoping it's all local to me, because that would be better, and I wouldn't have to have a subscription to their service. But this is looking like I have to register with console, and they're going to maintain it. So I don't know if that's something I would want to do, or that I would want to promote in my template. But I do agree with you that some kind of service discovery could be something good to include. Andreas, thank you for the follow. Alright, so hopefully I answered your question on service discovery. Centralized configuration, remote centralized configuration sounds like kind of the same thing. I don't want to create a dependency on a remote cloud-based offering for these solution templates. I don't know how often people are going to use that. I don't think it's in the 80% use case, right? And I want to keep this thing focused on what's usually useful. Alright, diagram and documentation. Let's talk about this. Very interesting template for design. It could be great if you could provide a diagram and document the components of your implementation. Agreed. And here's some things I've done with it. Here's an answer. But yeah, I should probably put this stuff in here. So I'm going to keep this one. I'm not going to waste time on the stream documenting stuff because I think that'll bore you. But I'm going to do this. So I guess that's an enhancement. And I'll take care of this in my copious spare time. So we'll leave that one there. Aggregate root methods accepting. Okay, so this is something that I had a client talking about, was how to interface with aggregate roots. And Brave Cobra says console has a control plane that you can use and run your own server. Okay, but it'll still be a separate server from your solution. And I use C4 modeling to generate architecture diagrams. Yep, I use plant UML usually for that. So you can add C4 to that if you want. But I usually go out here to create diagrams. Plant text is the other one. So plant text actually has text.com. That's not quite right. Probably gonna get some. There we go. Yeah, so here you can go and create whatever class diagrams and whatnot you want. So, Kabazi, thanks for the follow. Mr. Mortal, thanks for the follow. Appreciate it. The nice thing about these is that they're text, so you can just take the text and store it in your solution, or in GitHub as a comment or something like that, and then you can regenerate this anytime. You can edit it from that text, and you can do pull requests and stuff against the text if you want and kind of see what's changing. So I really like using these text-based UML tools. And plant text is all free, so you can just do all your work right here in the web. You don't have to install an expensive tool. Now, it won't do like code generation like some other tools will do that can take UML and actually generate a model and then generate code from that model. I think Star UML is one that does that. Star UML, yeah, I was just looking at this earlier today, so it's in my browser history. So there's an extension, all kinds of extensions for Star UML. And if you want to buy Star UML, it's like $89 for a license. I don't have it, I've never used it. But I was talking with some folks on DevBetter this morning about this. And they were recommending it, some of the DevBetter members. Yeah, and use Plant UML to generate GIFs, GIFs. Yep, VS Code plugin for Plant UML. Yes. Mr. Mortal, you are an architect! Exclamation point, question mark. Yes, I guess. I do architecture. Yeah, as well, okay. Simrask asks, is the clean architecture only for building APIs? No, it's not. It's a good question. So that's part of why I don't want to add features to it that would only be useful for APIs is because it's not. I covered this a little earlier, but real quick, whatever type of ASP.NET Core app you're building, this supports. So there's an API folder here which has kind of the APIs in it, and then the models for that are in this API models folder. If you're building something using traditional model view controller with views, it has controllers that return views, and it has a views folder with those views. And if you are into Razor Pages, which I recommend checking out, it has Razor Pages as well, right? So it has all of those things. And if you run it, it kind of shows you like here's the MVC stuff, here's the Razor Pages stuff. You can get to the API from the Swagger doc, so you can go in here and execute the API and get this version information back or whatever. So all that stuff is built into the template, and it doesn't matter which one you use, whether it's MVC, API, or Razor Pages. All right. Okay, so let me ask this. Well, okay, more questions. Greetings from a junior pursuing architecture from India. Welcome. Hope things are good for you in India. Hope you're staying safe with the whole global pandemic thing. It's got me working from my basement instead of my office. Hopefully the stream quality is okay this week. Sometimes I have trouble with my outbound bandwidth from my home internet connection. Surly Dev, if I'm taking your clean architecture repo as a starting point for a project, what's the correct way I should use it? What's the workflow? Do I fork it, clone it, rename it, whatever? I would recommend probably just downloading it, right? So I wouldn't fork it necessarily, unless you're expecting to do a pull request back to the generic clean architecture repo. Probably the first thing you're going to do is create your own version of it, and you're going to rename everything to be your company and your project, which is what you should do. So there's a couple ways to get started, and these are probably in the README, but not really. No. Yeah, getting started, how to use it. Yeah, that would be a good thing to put in a README, wouldn't it? Yeah. Let me first, while I'm thinking of it, add an issue, yet another issue, document how to use this, and add a getting started section to the README. You idiot who didn't do that ever. Include how to get the template and use it, e.g. fork versus clone versus download, zip, etc. There we go. So I will cover that. But to answer your question, I would just start with the zip file, right? So come to the code, come over here, say download zip, get it right here, show this in your folder, right click on it, and properties, make sure you unblock it because that'll cause you problems. Okay, now unzip this to wherever it is you're actually going to work. So there we go. And then open that up. And then the very first thing you'll probably want to do in here, like I say, is just change the name of it, right? So, you're going to come into each one of these things, and there's probably a way to do it faster. If you start with that solution template, it's much faster because it'll do it for you. But, you can say this is my, I don't know, Acme dot, widget store, whatever, whatever the name of your thing is. And just start changing that, and you can do a Control Shift F, replace everywhere, clean architecture with whatever your project thing is, and that'd be how I'd probably use it to get started. Now then the question is, how do you keep it up to date? Well, that's always the challenge, isn't it? So it is. I'm thinking I should only fork it if I was intending to update the template. Yes, I would agree with that. It says it's a Visual Studio template now. That's also true. Yeah. So let's do a new Visual Studio instance, and create a new project. And I don't know if I have it installed, but let's just search for clean. I don't think I have it on here. So if I go back to the browser and we install this template, I'm not sure if the template's up to 3.1 or not. And this is out of date too. I do say that. Oh, okay, yeah, no, we're good. That's good. Alright. So template is right here. Download. Now I've got this v6 file. Open that up. It's going to install this extension. It's got 6,000 downloads. That's pretty good. Install. It's going to say I need to end these tasks because I've got Visual Studio open. So we're going to get rid of these real quick. And eventually those should end. There we go. Alright, now it's going to install it. Simrask is asking, when you talk MVC, do you only mean Razor pages for the view part? Now there's a difference between Razor pages and traditional views. They both use Razor syntax, but Razor pages are a different way of organizing your code that does not use controllers. And instead of actions, it uses event handlers. Razor pages is actually a much cleaner way to organize your code because everything is in one place. With the traditional model view controller, you end up with different folders typically, right? You can use feature folders, which I recommend. But if you just follow the default, you're going to end up with different folders for models, maybe, but certainly for controllers and views. And so in a large application, you end up having to jump around all over the place, up and down inside of, let's see if I can show me, right here, you know, jump around inside of your Solution Explorer, up and down all over the place, and it's kind of annoying. All right, so we're going to create a new project now. And look, there it is. Look at that beautiful PNG file that's reversed in the dark mode for some weird reason. We can hit this and say next. And now I can give this a project name. This is the acme.widgetstore application, let's say. And sure, we'll throw it in there, and the solution name will be the same, I guess. All right, create. What does this do? So we can create a new clean architecture. It looks like it's creating them all with the clean architecture name, so that's maybe not ideal. It did rename the solution name, so that was nice of it. But all these things still say clean architecture, so you probably would still, even if you use that template, need to modify these namespaces. I thought it did that for you. Maybe it used to. Alright, so that's one way to do it, is with the project template. Okay. Alright, so Brave Cobra, how do you keep it up to date? Right. Once you get going in your project far enough, it'd likely be tough to just purely update it connected to source control. Exactly. So, Rhinosaurus Rex, I agree. So in terms of how you keep it up to date, if I'm updating the solution template, it's really not any different than the project templates that come in Visual Studio, right? So if you created a .NET Core application with a project template that Microsoft shipped in, say, 2.1, right? And then later on, it's 3.1, and they've changed it. And now startup.cs has all these different things, and there's breaking changes, and we're not going to add routing the way we used to. We're going to use endpoint routing. You have two choices. You either have to go in by hand and do a compare and see what's different from this startup to that startup, right? And all the different changes there. Or you have to go create a new project using the new template. So I'm going to say file new ASP.NET Core web project on 3.1. Or 5 that's coming out in a few months, you know, in November theoretically. And then take all your code and move it into that new template. This clean architecture as a solution template is basically the same thing, right? It's just at a solution level instead of a project level. So how do you keep it up to date? Well, if I make a new version and you see that, hey, I've updated to .NET Core version whatever, version 5, then you just need to do a diff. Right, you can just grab the latest one, put it on its own folder next to your one you've been using, and see what changed. Is probably the easiest. And if you want to be sure, then that you don't miss anything, right? Then you can just create a new solution from this, and then move all your code into that solution, which will take time, right? It's not as easy as I would like, but that's the best story I've got right now for how you would update. Okay, Surly Dev, oh nice, v6 template, right? Does that update when you do new releases? It looks like it. I don't know how the project template works. I didn't do it. So Greg Trevelick set that up for me. But it looks like it just had the latest when I grabbed it. So unless he's keeping it up to date separately somehow, which maybe he is, does this thing show like updates or anything? Rating and review, April 9th, Somebody was talking about it, so that's good. Q&A stuff in there. I don't see where it says when it was. Oh, there's last updated. Last updated 12.4. So he's updated it as of 12.4, and I updated my clean architecture solution to 3.1 back around that time also. So if I look at my history here, when we revved it to 3.1 was around that time. So yeah, so he's keeping it up to date. It's possible to offer this in NuGet package as well. I don't know how to do a solution template as a NuGet package. There might be a way, maybe. I don't know. Is that a way that one can distribute solution templates that are usable? I don't know how to do that as a NuGet package. It's a zip file, right? So if you want to grab it here as a zip, then that's easy enough. But I don't know that you could add it to an existing project as a NuGet package. That's how NuGet packages work. So I don't know. If you come up with a way for me to distribute this as a NuGet package, I would welcome that pull request, or even just leave an issue telling me about it. Okay, Surly Dev. I'm on furlough, create a local Windows account on my work laptop. So I want using my work account, and I'm thinking of downloading VS 2019 and Bleeding Edge one that is supposedly free, so I don't have to link it to my work account. Has anyone done this? Is it likely to upset my full VS install on my work account, or should it in theory be okay? I think it should in theory be okay. Because Visual Studio does do very well at side-by-side installs right now. In fact, I have, if you look down at these icons here, I have Visual Studio 2019 Preview sitting right next to Visual Studio, and they're completely side-by-side installs. So I would guess that you would be okay with different user accounts on the machine with being able to do separate installs of Visual Studio. Even better would be if you install the preview, right? When you're talking about installing Bleeding Edge, install the preview using your personal credentials. It should work just as well as the full version, but it'll definitely be a separate install, right? And it won't step on the existing one. Surly Dev says, I believe the preview version is always free. Yep, I agree. Brave Cove, I wasn't talking about the template. Oh, you weren't talking about the template in a NuGet package. I'm not sure what you were talking about in a NuGet package then. Maybe the v6? We'll update earlier project. Would it be possible to offer this in NuGet? Yeah, I'm not sure what you were. This as in the code in the repo. Okay, yeah, you could certainly take the code, the clean architecture code, like the shared kernel bits, right? The base classes and all this stuff here. That could be in a NuGet package. The reason why I don't put that in a NuGet package is because I want you to put it in a NuGet package. I want your company to have its own version of shared kernel that they keep in their NuGet package that has their base entity, that has the things their base entity needs to have on it, right? I don't expect most companies to want to just use what Steve says is the base shared kernel for clean architecture. And so I could put that into a NuGet package, but I think it's too likely that it would be customized by each organization or each team, that it wouldn't be valuable or it wouldn't be the right way to do it. All right. Surly Dev, I run both the stable and preview version side by side, and the only thing they're seeing is that they share the recent project list, which is probably fine. And I don't know that that would be shared between two different user profiles. Although if you're just talking about Visual Studio logins, I think they are shared. If you're talking about different Windows user profiles, then I think they probably wouldn't be shared. Why not? Aren't I the ruling authority? I don't think so. No, I'm always learning. And you know, again, if I want to update my template with something I just found that I thought was cool, I don't want to be worried that I'm going to break all kinds of companies that are out there taking a hard dependency on my NuGet package. All right, so I'm going to do that. That's me. Aggregate methods. Did we ever look at this? I looked at this. We had this question. All right, I pulled this up, but I didn't actually talk through it. Where'd this thing end up? This is from February. Hey, we're getting close to now. That's good. Still, February was pre-lockdown. It was a whole different world. Okay. I agree with Ardalis. However, in Ardalis' own book that I wrote, it says the application core holds this, blah, blah, blah. Services, DTOs. I would have thought DTOs would be more appropriate for the infrastructure and UI layers. Yeah, okay, so that's from 27 days ago. DTOs could live at different layers. That's right, BC, before Corona, before global pandemic. let me just answer this one real quick so I can close it. So DTOs can live in core, typically, as long as they do not reference any types that aren't either in the framework or in core, e.g. a view model or DB context, etc. Whether or not it makes sense to include DTOs in core, especially if they're only used by infrastructure or UI types, is a design choice. There's nothing in clean architecture that would prevent putting them in core, since they don't break the rule of pulling extra unwanted dependencies. There, so that's good enough. I have seen it both ways, where DTOs lived in core or DTOs lived in web, typically. I haven't seen DTOs living in infrastructure because that's not where I would want them. They usually are either defined in the web as things like API models. Let me see if I can open the correct clean architecture now that I've got several of them. I want the one in GitHub. So in here, if we look at my DTOs, I don't have a folder called DTOs, but I do have this to-do item DTO, which, you know, I go back and forth on whether I like that as a suffix or not. I'm not really a fan of it at the moment. This is what I named it some time ago. But it does call out the fact that this is a DTO and it's separate from the entity of to-do item. And then this thing has a method on it that will let it be constructed from the entity. So I'm not using AutoMapper in here because I didn't want to foist that upon everyone that uses this template. If I had a lot of entities and I was mapping them to and from their wire protocol formats, their DTOs for API models or view models or what have you, then I probably would end up installing AutoMapper at some point. But that's a separate discussion. The thing is, this DTO, if you look at its using statements, for one thing, it has a bunch it doesn't need, so let's clean that up. But if you look at these two using statements, there's nothing that would prevent this from living in core. Using system component model data annotations does not add any dependencies to core that are going to make it hard to test. So I could certainly take this and pull it up into core, but it's specifically for my API wire model. And this core project might support multiple different front ends, right? Maybe I have a web project that's for MVC, and I have another project that's sharing the same core that is for Web API. Does it make sense to have the DTOs for one of those projects and not the other one or whatever in core? Maybe, maybe not, right? So I could go either way on that. There's nothing that breaks the rules about pushing this into core, but it might not be the first place that a developer looks for it. And it might not be the right level of abstraction for a DTO. If this thing is purely concerned with API wire protocol, does that belong inside core, which is my business domain model and my higher level abstractions? There's some conveniences to having it there, to be sure. But again, it's not. I don't have a firm rule on that one. All right. Boom Boom asked a couple minutes ago, here's a question about core functionality. Suppose my data model is too complex to rely on things like EF. I have to tailor some data retrieval via stored procs. In this case, I can't really define core entities and business logic without looping back to some abstraction that interfaces with these data retrieval procedures. Is it reasonable for core to have such dependency? I disagree. I don't see why you would need to have business logic integrated with the stored procedures necessarily. Like, assuming you have a concept of entities and you have some way that you can get them, then I would define your complex entities and hierarchies in core. And then in infrastructure, I would write the data code necessary. And it could be as simple as this, right? Which, like, go fetch this thing by ID. Or it could be that you create your own custom repository or service or whatever you want to call it that calls a store procedure and then does all the work to take a data reader and convert it into your entity. But as long as there's some way to map from the database to your entity, that mapping logic goes in here of fetching it into some data specific format, a data reader, a data set, a data table, whatever it is, and then, or an XML document, it doesn't matter, and then translating that into and populating your entity. And then what comes out of this thing should be an entity, right? The interface that it's following, the abstractions that interface has, that interface is here, this I repository. Every one of these is a base entity. All right, the thing it's returning is going to be an entity. All right, so repository can be a dependency in core. The interface can be a dependency in core, yes. So if you're not using shared kernel, this iRepository interface we're looking at right here typically lives in core. And if we look at the eShop on Web sample that I mentioned earlier, if you want to see a real example, which I must have closed. Nope, there it is. In here, the application core interfaces, there is a repository in here. It's an async repository, so I called it async repo. And these are all tasks of T, right? So anything inside of core could depend on that if it wanted to. And you can extend it, right? So you can have an iOrder repository that inherits from that and adds additional methods to it. So if you've got some specific store procedure you need to call for some specific entity or aggregate that's really hard to create, you just inherit from the basic repository, if that makes sense, and add your specific store proc call there. All right. We put them in web, the DTOs. Yeah, okay. Surly Dev. I think I asked the question about DTOs in the past and wondered about them being passed out from the repository project to the UI project. And I'm sure you said that there could be a DTO for the record from storage and then populated to another DTO to pass to the UI. So the repository project, that's what we're talking about now, should always return domain types. So if you do put your DTOs in your core, then sure, they could return DTOs. But typically they should return entities. Right? Your domain model consists of your entities, your aggregates, your value objects, these things here, right? It's this basket aggregate or this order aggregate. Those are the things that represent your domain model. That's what your repository should be returning. If you then need to convert from that to a specific view model or API model or DTO, that should live in your UI layer or in an application service. So you don't always have an application service, and it doesn't always live in its own separate project. In this sample, there is a service in web. There's a few of them. I call them view model services because they're returning view models. So the basket view model service here, its job is to use a repository to get the basket and then return back a view model. So it does the work in here of creating a basket for given a user, and it returns back a view model. Is what an application service might do, for example. A colleague made me install AutoMapper in a project he was helping me with, but I'm not 100% sure what the pain point is that it was solving. Well, if you're doing a lot of mapping, if you have like a CRUD application that's mostly CRUD, but you don't want to expose your entities directly over the wire, because that's a bad idea for so many reasons that I am happy to get into if someone wants to ask, but otherwise I'll just leave it at that. Then if you have almost a one-to-one relationship between your entities, like this basket, and this basket has a buyer ID and a list of basket items, or this buyer, which has just an identity GUID, or an order, right? Order has a buyer ID, a date, a shipping address, and a list of items, right? So if you need to have, thank you, Surly Dev, if you need to have a DTO that represents this thing, it's going to have exactly the same types, exactly the same properties, or it's going to have a buyer ID and an order date and a ship to address. It gets really tedious to have to write the code for that. Now you can do it using code like this. This is usually what I start from. If I don't have AutoMapper, I'll usually create a static extension saying from this or to that will do this mapping, right? But eventually this gets tedious too, right? If you've got 20 entities and every single one of them has a corresponding DTO, and you're constantly having to map both directions, right? Because when you read them, you have to map from an entity to a DTO to send it over the wire. And then when you get an update, you've got to be able to take that DTO now and update an entity with it so you can make an update or create. And so that gets tedious. And so you can take this logic, and especially where these are all one for one, right? .id goes to ID, title goes to title, description goes to description. Like there's no logic here. There's nothing that changes. AutoMapper just does that by convention. So you take AutoMapper and you say, I want to have AutoMapper support mapping from to DTO to do item. Or in this case, it's the reverse, right? From to do item to do item DTO. And it just works, right? And you just say, instead of having to call this custom method that you had to write code for, you just say, mapper.map item comma item DTO, and it does it for you. All right, I'll come back to why is it a bad idea. Let me catch up on chat. Brave Cobra 2. I tend to avoid a generic repo as it forces you to expose CRUD statements, which you may not want to do. That's fair. If you typically don't need the CRUD operations, if you only need reads, for example, you can avoid the generic DTO. The other thing, or generic repository. The other thing you can do is something like this. If you know that you only ever need some aspects of a repository, you could say public interface I read only repository, and then you can move some methods here. And then you can say public interface if you want. This is another way you can do CQRS, by the way. I write only repository. Now the cool thing about this is that I can take these three methods right here, and this is a refactoring you can do with any big fat interface, not just repository. So if you've got legacy code which has big interfaces that are a pain to work with, split them up, right? Find some things that go together, break them out into their own stuff, and then check this out. I can say I read only repository, comma I write only repository, and I can build, and everything still works. Boom, succeed. Right, so I didn't change the binary compatibility of iRepository. It is still exactly the same interface it was before, but now anywhere I don't need all these write operations, let's say, and I only need to be able to do a get or a list, I can just request this through dependency injection, and it will just work. So that's my solution on this. Is split this up into just as fine-grained of an interface as you need. And that's step one, right? If you think that exposing the whole thing is too big. And then step two is feel free to create custom ones, right? So feel free to create a repository that only does this custom thing you need. And it could either inherit from the big one if you want to, or if it doesn't need to if you don't want to, right? This could just be literally just this one method or whatever. And the other thing, the other thing you can do here is use specifications. So I don't have time to get into specifications too much. I do want to add these to clean architecture, by the way. But specifications are another way to keep your repositories from getting all cluttered with custom methods. So I'd recommend you check these out. They're in this eShop on web thing. They're also in a NuGet package you can install separately. So if you go to github.com, like Ardalis, WAC specification, it's just a NuGet package. It actually has, I'm pretty proud of the integration test this thing runs that run inside of a NuGet, or run inside of a Docker container hosting SQL Server, so you can verify that all the translations to SQL actually work with this. Although I think they're broken at the moment, but they're cool when they work. Anyway, in here, the main guts of this thing is the specification evaluator here. And so you can use the base specification for defining your queries, and that's what specification is all about, is defining queries as classes, as objects. And so these, in terms of features, these support criteria, so your where clause. These support selectors, so .select in link, right? That's your select clause. They also will support includes. So in EF, a lot of times if you want to include related things like navigation properties, like an order with its items, it'll support that. It supports ordering, grouping, and paging. Then you can also use caching with it. So if you want to use data caching and you want to generate the key from the specification, you probably should. So this is a good place to do that. Yeah, so that's another project. This one most people haven't seen or heard of. I need to talk about it more. It's only got 52 stars, so go leave it a star and come back to it. It's good. Okay, falling behind on the things here, and I know I had something I was going to talk about that I've already forgotten about. Let's see. Talked about AutoMapper. Repository, install AutoMapper. It's missing something because things happen by magic. Yeah, the AutoMapper is a little bit magic, but it's convention based. You can customize how it does things if you need to. You may not want to expose every property on your domain object. Correct. Is AutoMapper helping me avoid that or enabling it to happen? It can be both. AutoMapper's it can be a foot gun. You can shoot yourself in the foot. So it's good and bad. You have to be careful with it. Okay, I know what. Somebody asked me, why is it bad to expose those things? Right. Okay, so let me talk about that real quick just because it's important. Let's say I have this to-do items controller here. And it has this post here. And it takes in a to-do item DTO because Steve said you should never expose your entity here. But what if I did? What if I just said, hey, I'm not going to bother with this whole thing, right? And we're just going to say this is that item, right? That's going to compile, right? Now this part won't. So we'll just say return OK, like that, right? All right, so let me build this. Now I'm taking here, this is my entity to-do item. This is my data model. It's my business model, but it's also what Entity Framework stores, right? So I'm going to say, pass me in whatever you want as this item. I'm not going to use a DTO. Okay, so this code will still work, right? I can say repository.add this item, and all my code is fine. Now, the problem with this, yeah, Brandonius knows where this is going, is if this item, either now or in the future, exposes something I don't want it to, then I can have problems, right? Like maybe this thing has some public date time, date created, get set equals date time dot UTC now, right? And maybe on my to-do list, I want to show these things in reverse date order. So like the most recent one I created, I want to see first, or something like that, right? And so that might be some logic that I have. So in here, if I run this thing and I go into my API Swagger stuff and I look at this post for a to-do item and it says I can add these things, well, maybe I don't want to expose date created as a thing that someone can add. Maybe I only want them to be able to give title and description. Well, right away, Swagger is going to show me that it's exposing everything, right? So that's helpful, I guess. But yeah, exactly. Brendan's talking about you could expose a has been paid, or you can expose other things that shouldn't be here. Date created is actually a pretty innocuous one. Another one that's worse from a security standpoint is, what if I have something like public user, and I have like an identity user here, right? User, and I don't have that in here, but created by user get set, right? And then somewhere user is public class user here, and this thing has public string username like that, but it also has public bool is admin on there, right, with a get set, let's say, right? Okay, so now what happens if I push up a user with my to-do item with is admin is true? Well, now I've just made myself an admin, right? Because when Entity Framework saves this thing, it's going to save this dependent property with it. So don't do that. Okay. Hopefully that covers that well enough. And I need to not commit any of this code if I make any changes here. Good. All right. I'm way behind on my chat stuff. Okay. Okay. Brave Cobra was talking about generic repos. Oh no, don't make me go there. Brave Cobra says EF Core is already a repository with a built-in unit of work. Oh no, you didn't say that. Yes, EF Core implements the repository pattern, but it does not count as your repository because the entire value of using the repository pattern in your application is in having an abstraction that you control that you can implement with whatever you want. So EF Core is an implementation of the pattern, kinda, sorta, and yeah, it has unit of work built into it too. But only if you're using EF Core for everything, right? It also does not serve as a unit of work abstraction. It only has unit of work built in within the implementation of EF Core. So don't think that you're getting all the benefits of repository or unit of work because you're using EF Core directly. You're not, because you're not getting the benefit of depending on an abstraction, right? You can't swap in another implementation easily in that case. Which is, I I don't want to be too vehement about that, but I see that argument all the time online, and it's annoying. It's like, oh, you don't need a repository; it's an anti-pattern because CF core does it all. Like, no, not. You're missing the point. All right, let me not spend too much time on that and keep going. An entity is a business class with an ID. It cannot exist without the context of an aggregate. He says. Check out my Pluralsight course if you reference it. No, I don't actually reference that Surly Dev, so I just covered it here real quick. Do you suggest, Kabazi asks, do you suggest that each domain should have its own DB context? We have multiple domains and each has its own DB context that points to the same database. My problem is that I can't write integration tests with in-memory DB context because each DB context has its own database in memory. Do you have any suggestion for this problem? Yes, you probably should have a separate DB context for each domain. Yes, in fact, if you have actually got separate domains, then they should probably have separate bounded contexts. And if they have separate bounded contexts, they should have separate everything. They should have a separate solution. They should have a separate database. They should be separate, right? That's the whole bounded part of a bounded context, is this boundary around that context. If they have overlap in their solution, in their source code, in their database, then it makes it so a lot of the advantages of having a bounded context go out the window. That's not to say it's not common for people to do that, but just be aware that the ideal state is that they would be totally separate. You can't write integration tests with in-memory database because each one has its own database in memory. I would recommend looking at something like having a test database or a SQLite possibly could work in that case. But yeah, you're going to have challenges with in-memory database. In fact, in-memory database has lots of problems for how it represents an actual database. It's not a database. It's like you said, it's an in-memory DB context. It doesn't handle keys very effectively. It isn't great about cleaning itself up statically, so it's really hard to write unit tests that reset themselves between each test if you're using the in-memory DB context. So there's a lot of issues with in-memory DB context. I used to be a fan, but I've since been bitten by it too many times, so I don't use it nearly as often as I used to. I use SQLite now, typically by default, possibly even in this project. I don't recall, maybe not. Yeah, I don't see SQL. Oh no, there it is. There's my SQLite database. So even in this project template, I think I'm using SQLite. All right. Surly Dev, this makes sense. I screenshotted it. Cool. Boom Boom says we're getting top-notch free software architecture masterclass. Thank you. Brave Cobra, Brandonius talking. Do you have time to get into specifications? You put that in a NuGet package. I did. Surly Dev's taking notes. Brendan says, if you notice you're doing the same sets of where, select, and include, these specifications are how you package those up. Yes. Your entity may not even be serializable. That's true. Could expose bad things, right? We talked about that. Alright, Brandonia says, I'm working on some code right now where, as the caller, I can't tell if my code is run by EF, Dapper, or SQL bulk copy. Right, so yeah, you shouldn't care what your data access is. It is true that most of the time, for most applications, you're not going to change your database. But it is really flexible to be able to change how you do data access. And Microsoft tends to ship data access platforms fairly frequently, right? If you look back over, a 20-year period, they've had a lot of different data access technologies. And I wouldn't be surprised if they continue to change them. And it's not that unusual that you might want to swap out between Dapper and Entity Framework or some other mechanism within the same application. And by having an abstraction that you're coding against, you allow for that very easily. Would you recommend Dapper? I put it on my furlough learning list. Yeah, Dapper's nice, and it's super easy. It's super simple. So don't feel like you have to set aside a whole lot of time for it. You can learn Dapper in a couple hours. I could do a stream just on Dapper, and Brendan, you probably have, right? You probably have a YouTube video you could point to of a stream you did on Dapper, I would guess. Yeah, RDO and Jet, they're still around. You can still use Access as your database probably for a .NET Core app if you want. Alright. We did Dapper for a whole project on my stream. See? I knew you would. You've been doing all kinds of cool stuff on your stream. So tell everybody about your stream, Brendan. Or your YouTube video. I don't know, do I have to bless you or something to make it so you're allowed to do that? I don't think I have my chat locked down. But yeah, Brendan's got a stream as well, and he talks about all kinds of cool stuff. You should check it out. He and I have known each other for years. Okay, so let me get back to some semblance of what I was trying to get done today, which was there. I closed that one. So let me go back to my list. Oh yeah, and then some people created this stupid thing called Dapper with like DAPR that Brave Cobra's mentioning there, and Dapper, the wrong Dapper is a bad name, poorly named thing that's also this serverless runtime Dapper.io, and they became aware, like they renamed to this, right? And they became aware of Dapper as being this really popular thing for that Stack Overflow built, and they were like, nah, we don't care, we're gonna keep this name. So yeah, I'm not a fan of their name. I haven't used their tooling, but I'm what's the word I want? I'm even without having worked with it at all, I'm annoyed by the fact that they chose a name that is already going to be causing confusion. All right. Update Visual Studio template to use this. That's done. I just verified. I published this. All right. Thanks. Closing comment. Done. Is it pronounced Dap-R rather than Dapper? I don't know. Who can say, right? No idea. Most people probably would pronounce it Dapper, just like Flickr is Flickr, not Flick-R. Right? Unless you're a pirate. Alright, feature request. Organized by feature. Yeah, that would be good. Diagrams. I said I would do that. So I would do that. Dispatch method and all events are never raised. This sounds like a bug. I think it was fixed. And it works. Okay. Yeah, I know I fixed this. Alright, so different domains, Fenatone, values and all. At 1UX, if this is still a problem, can you open a new issue? I think this is working now. Boom. Pretty sure I fixed all that. Alright. Is that an extension for showing the file? Yes, this is an awesome extension. This is Octotree, and it's a GitHub, or it's a Chrome extension, sorry. Login, unlock. I don't want to unlock more features. I want to show where to get this thing. Chrome Octotree extension, right? It's also an extension for Firefox too, I think. But you want this. You want this Octotree, which I'll paste in the chat. And yeah, the Octotree extension is really nice for being able to come into any arbitrary project on GitHub and look around on it. So, you know, being able to do this is a way nicer way to navigate on any GitHub project. I don't know why GitHub doesn't just buy Octotree or create their own, because I use this constantly. It's amazing. Alright. Brendonius is talking about his streams. That's cool. You should check those out. Alright. Using... That's an interesting one. 8 hours ago someone opened up. I'm going to have to try and get to that. But I only have 15 minutes left. What is the proper namespace for a class which uses a method, uses as method parameter? I want to know what is the proper namespace for public bar class is a DTO. Foo is just a method. Let's say the parameter class lives in the core layer. I think this class cannot be in the root of core. There should be a folder for it. Alright. Well, that parameter is a parameter object, and a parameter object is basically a DTO. So, update, for example, the author of this class selected DTO, isn't it? Yeah. Yes, I think DTO or something similar, perhaps more intention revealing, like commands would make sense. Parameter objects like this one are often commands or events, so those are the two kinds of DTOs that first come to mind for naming a folder full of these objects. Boom. Alright. Cool. More chatting. Surly Dev and Brendan. Alright. Alright, back here. I want to get to that one that someone just asked. Alright, this one I think is good. In startup setup, the connection string is hard-coded. What if I want one from app settings.json? Is it okay if I add a parameter connection string to there? Yeah, that would be fine. Am I still hard-coding that? I've totally changed how that works at this point. So startup setup, or have I? That is hard-coded. Yeah, no, he could do that. I probably should pull that from app settings. App settings. There is a default connection there. And in startup, I used to use that one. I probably should again. Yeah, I totally agree with everybody. It used to pull it from startup. Now the trick is that this doesn't take a parameter. It's just an extension method, so I'd have to pass it in from here, which I think is what he's saying. Yes. Yes, I'll fix that unless someone beats me to it. Comment, label, help wanted, good first issue, enhancement, sure, /bug. It's almost a bug, but it's not really broken, so there you go. If somebody wants to knock out number 102, knock yourself out. That's an easy one. Alright, sequence diagrams. That was me. And I added this stuff. And I want to add it to the documentation, so I'm going to add that to the docs at some point. 104, none of the API controllers are consumed. I have a link, but this does not call that. Instead it calls that. They're accessible from the Swagger link in the homepage. Let's run it. And screenshot that, and we'll close that. So here's this screenshot. There's an arrow right there. Copy that. Go back to this. There's that. And then come back to this, click the thing. Screenshot it again. Copy that. Copy that. Copy that. Which leads to that. Is that sufficient? Normally the APIs would be consumed by other applications or a front end like Angular, etc. Alright, that one's done. Okay, that I need to fix. That's me. That's this one. Alright, should we separate the REST API? Setting clean architecture. Say we want to separate this. You can certainly separate out the APIs from the MVC or Razor pages implementation. I expect most users of this template will probably only use one of these 3 technologies and will remove the ones they don't need. If you need 2 of them but want them in separate projects, just copy the web project as needed. Bam. Surly Dev, pair programming video. Yeah, Brendan and I did that pair programming video. Okay. Kabazi, I've implemented a library based on your blog, moving controllers to Mediator. I appreciate if you could take a look at it. Yeah, send me a link to your library, Kabazi. In fact, adding the API Endpoints project to Clean Architecture is an issue I just added today, if you didn't see. Right there, number 108, which we're slowly getting up to. I'm curious about this one here. It's 107, which might be the last thing we have time to look at. So, okay, this makes sense. So, he likes this template, uses it a lot. That's cool. One thing you notice is if you add events to an entity, you delete the entity, then the events are not dispatched because the deleted entity is not found in the change tracker after save change is completed. I've fixed it here by getting all the deleted items before save changes is executed. It's an interesting issue. So I wonder if you would want them to, though. It's interesting. I don't know that use case would want events to be fired from deleted entities. But assuming you do, this is a good thing to fix. So let's talk about that for a minute. I have domain events configured inside of this project, and when a domain event gets registered, it doesn't fire off immediately. So let's look at to-do item for a minute for an example of this. So in to-do item, there's no way to set that it's done, right? You just call this mark complete method. So this is making sure that we don't have a very anemic domain model. We're making it so that the actual behavior of the system is done through methods that have behavior that trigger things. So in this case, we add this to-do item completed event, which will be dispatched when to-do item gets saved. But what if I mark this complete, and then in the same operation, I delete it? Then this event will never get fired. I don't know why I would want to delete it, because a completed event is something I probably want to display in the UI. But let's just say that I do that. Does it make sense for this event to still fire, even though this item was deleted? That's the question. And again, we're not talking about just a to-do item scenario. We're talking about anything. All right, what if I have an order, and inside my order I call some method to modify like the address of the order, and that queues up an event that's going to do something about that, and then I delete the order? Does the event still make sense? Because the event's probably got a reference to this entity, right? Like this one does. If this entity is gone, what's the event handler going to do? When it tries to look up this event, it's going to get a 404. It's going to get a null. It's going to blow up. So I'm not sure that this is necessarily a bug per se, but it's something definitely to think about. Anyone on the stream have a thought on this? Should domain events be fired after saving an entity, and as part of saving that entity, you deleted that entity? Should the events that were tied to that entity still be dispatched? You still with me, Brendan? What do you think? You might if the event also triggers something else within the aggregate. And we realize there's two different types of domain events, right? There's domain events that happen before persistence that trigger side effects just within your domain, and then there's domain events that happen after persistence, which ideally trigger side effects outside your domain, like sending a notification to a user, for instance. And specifically, these events are post-persistence events. That's how they're implemented. So in my AppDB context, the code that he's referencing is this code right here. So I override save changes. I first call base.saveChanges, and then I look through all the entities that have events, and I dispatch them. Yeah, and that's why the delete thing doesn't work, is because the deleted entities aren't here at this point, and so their events are lost when they're deleted. And Brendan agrees that it's not a simple answer. So yeah, I think it's important to know which way your system is going to handle it, and to write your code accordingly. But I don't know that it's a bug necessarily, so I gotta check that out. Webface CA, glad to have you here today. Sorry you gotta go. Feel free to follow if you haven't. Okay, let me catch up on the chat. Brendonius, I wonder what library we made from that. It's basically just leveraging a library already. Which library? You're talking about my library, the endpoints library. Because I'm not using Mediator for API endpoints, right? So that's part of the point, is that Mediator is not even necessary anymore. So I don't know if you've had a chance to look at that, Brendan. But Kabazi's got the link there. Oh, no, he doesn't. Kabazi's got his thing, yeah. So looks a lot like mine. But yeah, mine's got no dependencies. This one. Alright, and then Kabazi's is this one. And alright, let me see. JSteph. In the past few days I was reading about clean architecture versus hexagonal, ports and adapters. From a high level, what are the pros and cons of building web apps with these two? And what kind of projects are these? I know that this is very specific for the domain problem that should be solved and addressed, but can you say something about this comparison from your experience, and if there are some examples on GitHub? I generally, just to be clear, consider clean architecture, onion architecture, ports and adapters, hexagonal architecture, they're all essentially the same thing. So if you're looking for like me to compare and contrast between them, yeah, there's not a whole lot of difference. Now, what I will compare and contrast with is any of those, let's just call it clean architecture because that's what my template uses, compared to N-tier architecture, right? Or no separation, where you just put everything in one project. N-tier architecture is bad from a perspective of the traditional way you would structure it. Is you'd have your web layer, and it would depend on, let's see where my hands go. Right here, you get your web layer, and it would depend on the business layer right below it, and it would depend on the data layer right below it, and that would depend on the database below that. And that tended to have all your dependencies depending on the database, which made it hard to test, hard to change. If you had a shared database, which most companies did, now you have multiple different applications, all depending on the same database, and it just makes it really hard to change things, right? It causes, because of all that dependency and tight coupling, it makes it really difficult to change your system. Clean architecture basically follows the dependency inversion principle. It says, no, we're going to have our core, our domain model, our business layer be the center, and everything else depends on that. And data access, database, that's just a side concern. That's infrastructure. We can swap that out if we want with an adapter through a port, with an implementation of an interface. And so we no longer make the database the center of the universe. We make the business logic, we make the domain model the center of the universe. We have this domain-centric architecture, which I talk about in the DDD course on Pluralsight. And so that's the biggest difference, is that dependency direction. And the results of that are that you have a lot more flexibility, a lot more testability, and it's a lot easier for you to manipulate your design and change over time. All right, Kabazi, you had a specific question, right? You were like, way back up there in the chat, you were like, hey, I did something with your endpoints and I have a question. And I don't know what the question was, but I've got your page up on my screen here, and I've got a couple minutes left before I got to run. Should the delete dispatch an application deleted event in save changes? That is the exact question, Brave Cobra 2. So that is another option. I'm going to wait for Kabazi to answer my question of what I'm supposed to look at here in his thing. And I'm going to go back to this other... No, I'm going to go back to this one. And I'll say... let's see. I'm not sure it makes sense to always fire events on deleted entities, especially since most of my events I raise from entities include a reference to the entity itself. If it's been deleted, event handlers for this entity are likely to have problems. Closing. Feel free to reply if you have more questions. Boom. Alright. Kabazi, we're so close, man. I'm on your page right here, and you have an issue about that? No. What was your question? I created this library which maps Mediator directly to ASP.NET Routing without MVC or controllers when I'm figuring out how I can improve it. Okay. Solves the issue with controllers. But I do that too. I have my own library. Mine doesn't use Mediator though, so I don't know where to even start to look for this. Here's your sample. Let's look at your sample. So you have requests, you have a sample request. This request is I take a post and that uses Mediator. So this is a thing. It's your handler. Alright. Thanks, Brendan. Alright. Benchmark. You testing performance here between the two? I will have to spend more than 60 seconds looking at this, Kabazi, but I'll try and have a look at it. It looks like it's very similar to my project here, which I intend to add to clean architecture as another option, but mine doesn't need mediator. Yours is just leveraging mediator, and mine depends on controllers. Yours doesn't depend on controllers, so that's seems like the biggest difference, right? Because your sample here, you're able to build these requests out, and they don't even need controllers. They need system HTTP heap, but that's just for the post attribute. Yeah, so you don't even have much of a dependency on system, on ASP.NET Core stuff, which is cool. To wire this up, you just add mediator and your NuGet package. Nice. And map mediator. Okay, so this is your new thing, is map mediator. Alright. So where is that at? It must be a route builder extension. So map mediator does this. Okay. That's cool. I like what you're ending up with. What I see, it looks cool. So I'm not sure what issues you're looking at improving. The only big difference I see between yours and mine I already covered, right? Like yours is happy to take a hard dependency on mediator. Mine's fine to stay dependent on ASP.NET Core. But at the end of the day, they both let you create requests that don't require controllers, or handlers that don't require controllers, which I think is a good thing. So yeah, my quick initial reaction is it looks cool. So good job. For whatever my opinion's worth, and I'll take a look at it. I don't know. I didn't see the results of your benchmarks, so I don't know if it's faster substantially than the MVC version or not. But that would be interesting to know if your benchmarks results were that yours is like leaps and bounds faster than going through the controller. That'd be good to know. It's on the README. Of course, it's on the README. Silly Steve. Look at the README. Okay, so here we go. So with your endpoints version, your average is less memory, less Gen 0 collections, and takes 50 microseconds versus 150. So yeah, that's a little faster. I don't know if that matters too much, because these aren't even milliseconds, right? These are microseconds. So that extra 100 millionths of a second, but maybe it adds up. I don't know. It's definitely faster, so it's cool. I like it. You gotta rev your NuGet to like at least 0.9 or something, so people feel safe using it. Then you'll see your downloads go up probably. All right, I need to go because it's grocery day. We're getting groceries about once a month now, so I've got a big order I've got to pick up at the store here in Quarantineville. So let me see if there is some other live coder. Twitch.tv/team live coders, and I bet you guys would appreciate seeing what Ed Charbonneau is working on. So I'm gonna jump to his thing with a raid. So let's go here, and let's go to my dashboard here, and there's us, and we're going to raid Ed Charbonneau and start that raid. Brendan says use John Skeet's suggestion of never starting with 0 to X, start with 1. Alright, so we're loading you all up to raid Ed. He's usually working on Blazor stuff, so I will jump in there just for a minute to say hi, but we're going to raid him now, and I'm going to stop my stream. And thanks to all of you for coming out today, and I hope to see you next week.